Number 10. Marriage.
Poor good women have lost a marriage into war, famine, disease, and disaster.
I know some might think initially that this isn't a punishment, but in the cases of the Victorian women, the societal status of being a woman was only seen based off of the ideologies that needed to be pure and clean. Your bodies were seen as temples, and it shouldn't be decorated with jewelry, nor should it be used for physical activities or your own personal pleasures. You couldn't oppose men, and you being wealthy or a spinster was the only exception. Single women were looked down on with shame and pitied, and as your main purpose as a woman was to marry and reproduce. Even young girls at the age of 8 to 12 would stop working as if there was no child labor laws or protection laws for children, and as soon as these women or young girls were able to menstruate, they would be negotiated into marriage and no longer be able to sustain themselves financially or just be a kid. And being a poor married woman wasn't an option, as you had no individual rights under law. Married women were only seen as one with their husband, and the husband would be the manager and entitled to all of your properties, as it was seen more as a business, and you were being micromanaged constantly until death do you part. Number 9. No rights. As I mentioned with marriage, women didn't have any rights, as they were seen primarily as second-class citizens, and if you were a woman of color, my goodness, you were definitely seen less than human. Women who had to be married ended up losing everything they owned, inherited, or earned, and it would belong to their husband. Once a woman married, control of any property she owned as well as any income she received from it passed to her husband. Although he could not dispose of it without her consent, her property, her personal property such as money or earnings or investments, and personal belongings such as jewelry passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his consent, and if you were in a loveless marriage or a harmful one, you couldn't divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even a concept for women to execute without losing their own amenities, even in the court of law until the 1970s, almost 100 years or so later, after the spark of the women's suffrage movement in the mid-late 1800s. So men had the right to divorce his wife under the grounds of adultery, but women had to prove her husband was unfaithful, combined with other allegations including cruelty, bigamy, incest, and so on. Luckily, in the 1857 Act, divorce did become a bit easier little by little, but again only under the impression that the woman had legal grounds and proof her husband was unfaithful with evidentiary support to back up her claims. And even then, she could finally earn some of her possessions. As for the husbands, if he wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't have to do anything, he could just say it and it would be fine. Number 8. No education. To me, education is extremely important, as it was something I learned growing up in my family, that education liberates you to understand yourself, those around you, and the world better. And for women in this era, they were received less education than men. They were banned from universities and could only obtain low-income paying jobs, as she was not allowed to follow a profession, as they were all closed to women. And the irony of them having Queen Victoria as the reigning accolade of this era, a woman and women of these times couldn't get an education to liberate herself or her children from defamation if the husband no longer sees her as a useful asset. So for women, especially those who could afford it, was raised in a privileged household with financial backings and exceptional family background, her education was only seen as accomplishments. Like, oh darling, she's a very accomplished woman, is something you might hear in these type of movies that depict the era, which only indicates that she had artistic talents like singing, dancing, and knowing foreign languages, and anything to help earn them a husband and be a benefit in the house. Even doctors at this time believed that if a woman studied too much education, she would stunt her ability to reproduce. Wild as hell. And when university allowed women to attend their lecture halls, their families would actually forbid them from going, worried that it would prevent them from finding a husband. Number 7. The right to work. Work was only available to those who had no choice, as their societal status prevented them from leveling up to the ladder to have a better life independently. Even more so, women who were labeled as part of the working class, these women fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the working force in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Even more so, those who were labeled as part of the working class, women of this era fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the workforce in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Women that had jobs outside of the home made them less likely to marry, leaving them with no choice but to stay in undesirable situations that made them undesirable themselves. In one study by the Buffalo State had noticed classing women and children together as helpless creatures needing the protection of strong men. They were indignant at the knowledge that women had to support themselves, that they had suffered degrading wrongs as working women. So for some, they'd have to result themselves into committing adult work, or even for some unfortunate circumstances, be sold into adult work, as they had often had heavy debts from predecessors or even used as bargaining chips for their partners. Poor women were not regarded as the Victorian society, as they could not fight back, as men had captured these women, straight up kidnapping them and kept them at their house. Differences in societal classes led to some women being ignored and unacknowledged in society for economic reasons and for the pleasures of some men. Women of the night had no exits of this profession and were stuck in this life, and they would be beaten, tormented, as this was obviously shamed on, as well as being arrested, which would lead us to number 6. Number 6. Women who were in prison. In some revolutionary standpoints, being in prison might make you look like a hero or a villain, as it depends of what you were doing or what you stood for. For the Victorian era, women who had been the most vocal at this time for a multitude of things like women's rights, the women who were caught in the act of selling their bodies in order to obtain financial means would be arrested and sent to prison. But even women who were not adult workers would be arrested. Women who had premarital pregnancies, truancies, or adultery, or kept bad company would also be arrested. They would be sent to prisons or reformities, as for women of these times, a small step off of the Victorian pedestal made for a long fall. Women sent to prison in the Victorian England were subjected to regimes whose project was to enforce idealized femininity. This individualized treatment aimed at more regeneration than discipline and was administered by an entirely female staff aided by middle-class philanthropic lady visitors. Considering women were placed only into two categories, being a wife and a mother, the reality is that they lived in a world that discriminated heavily against them. Due to their superior physical strength, men considered themselves the dominant sex and sought to keep women subdued for as long as they could. Number 5. Strangulation. Now for the more morbid section on this list, although stoning may seem like a common thing in this era as a form of capital punishment, whereas an individual is pelted with stones until death, actually was not common associated with ancient Egyptian legal practices based on available historical and archaeological evidence. The primary method of execution in ancient Egypt was typically strangulation or impalement. Stoning as a form of capital punishment is more commonly associated with other ancient cultures in the region, such as ancient Mesopotamia or parts of the Levant. In these societies, stoning was indeed known as a form of capital punishment for various offenses, including adultery. Strangulation was one of the most common methods of execution in ancient Egypt. It was typically used for serious offenses and could be applied for both men and women. In cases where capital punishment was deemed necessary, strangulation was a method employed to carry out the sentence. Number 4. Lacerations. When it comes to corporal punishments, as I mentioned above, those who do commit adultery might deal with the consistency of beatings or lacerations. Texts speak of thrashing with a wooden stick, give 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 or even 200 times. They also mention branding and mutilation of the nose and ears. Tomb reliefs often show beatings of people, but in most cases these are private coercions of subordinates, not an official penalty. Sometimes the culprits are bound to a pillory. These punishments were all carried out in public and therefore also meant a loss of honor and degradation of the culprits. The results of these measures can be seen on many skeletons, as they are also including cutting off limbs, noses, and other parts of the body as a form of punishment, specifically connected to adultery or if you were married, specifically a married woman. It is a crime deserving of death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. The husband had a legal right to punish or forgive his wife or leave the court if the husband accuses the wife with no proof. The punishment of a man was much lighter, and the woman of the crime of adultery, as the Egyptians believed, that offense falls primarily in the hands of the woman, while the women would be killed as the men would severe just 1,000 blows. Number 3. Burning alive. Referring back to the Code of Hammurabi, the code was enlisted under the morals and the laws in ancient Egypt and Babylon. When it came to intimate relationships with your close family, you'd be subjected to many listed punishments, as in dealing with seduction or physically harming someone intimately. The Hammurabi inflicts the penalty of burning if you were to have a physical intimacy with your mother, but since this was ancient Egypt, unless you were royal who needed to pull an Oedipus complex to maintain your rule and connection to the monarch position, it wasn't something looked down on but normalized. As this is a civilization that needed a monarch rule at all times to guide the nation, but it is good to note that it was a typical Western interpretation that this era was prone to burning alive people, when the irony was that the Europeans burning women, being witches or even more heresy, were more burned. Number 2. Head be gone. The ancient Egyptians set harsh punishments for those accused of treason or corruption. The death penalty was usually applied by impalement, thumping, or a 100-fold fine, and this applied to both men and women. The decree also referred to the death penalty for someone who steals an animal belonging to the temple and transfer it to another party, while confiscating the property of the thief in favor of the stolen temple. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between the stolen goods and the attribute of holiness, and considered it a religious crime that requires execution, and those stolen goods that do not affect the sanctities, settling for the penalties of beating and the fine for the theft 100 times of the value of the stolen items. Number 1. Buried alive. Of course, all of these leads to death eventually, as the punishments were drastic, dangerous, violent, and vile. I mean, if you somehow survived the beheading, then what a miracle that would be. But death was only reserved for the extreme measures of punishment for women of these times. As I mentioned, there was very minimal, if not just the common punishment of corporal punishment. The scariest, in my opinion, would be buried alive. In some cases, individuals might be sentenced to be buried alive, although this was likely a very rare extreme form of punishment, most likely only reserved for the ones with extreme cases of crime. It's important to keep in mind that our our knowledge of specific cases and punishment in ancient Egypt is limited, as much of what we know is derived from inscriptions, legal texts, and other historical records. Additionally, practices may have varied over time and in different regions of ancient Egypt. The legal systems and punishments evolved over the millennia, so there could be variations in practices depending on the specific period within ancient Egypt history. Violence against women is a human rights violation, potentially touching on the rights to life, to equality, to liberty, and security of persons, to equal protection under the law, to be free from all forms of discrimination and violence, to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health, to just the favorable conditions to work, as well as the rights to not subjected to and cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. And although the cruelty and damages to women was abhorrent and tragic, it still lingers in our day, as now 60% of women still don't report crimes due to fear of shame and stigma.
Punishment number 10 is ash bath. Just saying medieval times doesn't actually mean much. Every empire and kingdom had its own respective medieval time at different times than one another. So, Persia spanned from the 6th century to the 15th century, during which time they concocted some truly heinous punishments for those who did wrong, or at least those who did wrong in the eyes of whatever crazy leader was in charge at the time. Setting the stage for long-suffering death everywhere, Persia introduced such styles as forcing people to drink molten gold, tearing people apart with trees, and drowning them in ash. This punishment was one of the worst deaths you could receive, reserved for the worst criminals and those guilty of high treason or offenses against the gods. And it was horrifying. It consisted of throwing a victim into a 75-foot tower filled with ashes. You'd break a couple of bones, but it was a soft landing. From outside the tower, large hand cranks were spun by a team of men, sending the ashes flying and disrupting the solid pile so that the victim was pushed deeper and deeper down the tower, suffocating on burnt ash until they drowned in it. If you've dipped your toes in the Bible, you may know there's quite a few people that got this sentence in there, such as a corrupt Jewish priest whose family isn't allowed to bury his remains, with a bunch of sassy snaps added. However, the concubines caught planning coups against their leader on several occasions met this fate too. Punishment number 9 is the evil field. So medieval Rome is characterized by the break with Constantinople and the formation of the Papal State, technically ongoing until its collapse, which marks the beginning of Europe's medieval period. On the topic of being buried while still breathing, the Romans also enjoyed dumping people into holes alive in their medieval times. One famous example is the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the hearth goddess Vesta, who were sworn to chastity. However, should they break that chastity vow, they had a special acre of grass dedicated just to burying them alive. Like most deaths, Romans like to make a big show of it, and the Vestal breaking her virginity vow would naturally be the Sunday matinee. They had an entire little ritual. She'd be carried on a litter throughout the city in the nude until they reached the Campus Secularis, aka the evil field. There, an underground chamber awaited in which she'd be lowered into and sealed inside alive. There was only one ever known instance in Roman history where a Vestal Virgin wasn't slain for breaking her vows. That would be Julia Aquilia Severa, the wife, then ex-wife, then wife again, of Emperor Elagabalus. It's believed that Julia remained with him until they were killed in the year 222, but who's to say they put Julia in the ground after. Punishment number 8 is the finger cinch. China's medieval period was between the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE and the fall of the Mongol Dynasty in 1368 CE. Famous in the Chinese feudal dynasty, this form of punishment was specifically made for the woman who did not obey her master's command. Master can be taken literally, should it be a concubine or a servant, but also figuratively like her parents or husband. The offenders have to put their fingers inside a specialized tool which look like interlocking combs. The device would then squeeze the fingertips, causing immense pain and loss of circulation. If the victim faints, ice water would be thrown on her as a wake-up call. The punishment would continue until the victim was deprived of all their strength. The device was prepared in every shape and size to crush the fingers of any female, so she may ultimately surrender to male prejudice. Punishment number 7 is the four witnesses. The Ottoman Empire was born very shortly, around 100 years at most, before the European medieval period started. As stated, it began when Rome broke from Constantinople, and thus it finished alongside the other European nations in the 16th century. How they punish adultery is akin to many cultures. Man cheats, no punishment. Woman cheats, world must be ending. The Ottoman criminal code did not distinguish between fornication and adultery. Zina was the word used for both, and both were unacceptable from a woman of any kind. And when caught in an alleged act of zina, in order to ensure the women were not wrongfully accused, the accusers required to produce 4 witnesses of good standing that actually observed the act of intercourse as it was happening. Imagine that. You walk in on your wife in bed with your best friend. So you have to run yelling into the streets for 4 people to come right now and see them while they're still hurriedly dressing, so you have some chance of getting her punished. However, even if you do manage to pull off 4 witnesses, if the witnesses can't be found at the time of the woman's trial, then the accusing husband will be flogged 80 stripes and ignored. So what I'm hearing is, as a cheating wife, you could essentially make the little problem go away if these 4 witnesses were to, I don't know, just casually disappear before the court date. However, on a terrifying note, the husband's second option when calling the 4 witnesses to his house is taking justice into his own hands. He can actually just kill his wife on the spot and face no punishment nor require going to court, even if the witnesses didn't see the wife cheating beforehand. Punishment number 6 is marks and tattoos. European medieval period started with the fall of Rome in 476 AD and extended to roughly 1450. Meanwhile, a fun fact, the Americas never experienced a medieval period because a feudal system was never actually established in that hemisphere. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, protagonist Hester Prynne is marked with a red A to see her as an adulterer. This was practiced in a few regions of medieval Europe, such as Spain, France, even Britain. However, it was reserved for working girls and their keepers and continued well out of the medieval period until the Ancien regime. Women who committed the crime of Puritanism were branded with hot iron to show the world how frivolous they are. The working girls received a P on the arm, the booty, or the forehead, which I feel is a bit vindictive and personal. Meanwhile, the keepers were branded with an M accompanied by a fleur-de-lis. King Charles IV even made them outlaws, stating that may all girls of joy and public women desolate from our court in said time under pain of whip and mark. After the establishment of the New World, which is out of the medieval period, but as stated, the Americas didn't have one, we see branding laws in colonies more akin to Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, such as the 1658 Plymouth Law that stated adulterers must mark every garment they own to identify them of their crime. Adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subjected to public whipping and further humiliation. Number 5 is also used to shut wives and women up. It's the shrews, fiddle, and fife. But I could be wrong. It could be pronounced fife like the country or fief like thief. Cannot tell for the life of me. Anyways, you've heard the boring shrews scold 100 times. I'm here to bring you a new exciting product if you want to publicly shame some women, but also simultaneously make it look like they're starting medieval times' most vibing jazz band. The shrews fiddle or shame fiddle was a wooden contraption shaped roughly like a fiddle or a fife or fief or whatever it is, which is a type of flute that acted like a portable stocks for your fingers and your neck. The shame flute was specifically designed to punish those who made bad music. However, these shrews implements are titled after the ladies that were tossed in them constantly, people who spoke up to their husbands or argued with one another. The next 4 titles on this list, I'm not kidding, are all rippers of some kind. We're gonna start with number 4, the chest ripper. If I instinctually put my hands on my chest while we're talking, you will understand why in a second. This was a device made specifically and only for women to destroy a very specific aspect of femininity and thus remove what the medieval people perceived to be her desirability. And man, did these dudes have a weird ass fixation on doing stuff to breasts. Burned, brand, carved, or simply amputated. This is called sensual torture, but swap the N and the S for the letter X. It extends back to the time of ancient Rome and likely long before then too, but worst of all was a device coined in medieval England known as the breast ripper. A metal claw that pierced the flesh of the breast of the victim who was tied down and then pulled away forcibly, shredding it to pieces. It was used as both a method of punishment to mark breasts of unmarried mothers and women convinced of heresy, adultery, and hosts of other crimes, but also for interrogation, because nothing is gonna make someone confess to being a witch faster than a sociopath with a giant pair of tongs. Number 3 is a rear ripper. It's unlikely, but if there was anything worse than the breast ripper, it's probably the pair of anguish. Recognizable now from video games and movies and leather bedrooms with red latex accents, this pear-shaped device was one of the many horrific devices that made it to the modern world, but was reborn with better purposes. A few medical devices have taken a page out of its book, such as the dreaded thing they use at gynecology appointments, and some birthing and colonoscopy gear. So, the pear is made up of 4 leaves. These are joined at the hinge at the top and a key or a crank on one end. As you can see on screen, it's named accordingly. The pear was inserted into one of the 3 viable orifices, 2 if it's a dude, depending on the nature of the crime committed. The oral device was reserved for heretics, while the back door and the middle door pairs were used on, you could never guess, witches, witchcraft. Ooh. Man, medieval times must have looked like the set of Halloween Town, the way that witchcraft is constantly referenced. Anyways, turning the key opened the leaves, and every little click of the key causes massive internal damage that was rarely fatal, but very thorough way to get a confession out of someone, or just about anything. I'm pretty sure the average person would admit to something as ludicrous as riding a magic donkey out of the king's palace if it meant that would stop. Number 2 is another rear ripper. Yeah, they liked those. Come to think of it, for such a sensually repressed society, they seem to get quite raunchy with their punishments. It's almost like that's the reason you shouldn't repress feelings like that. The Judas cradle, also known as the gilded cradle, was a regular stool with a wooden or metal pyramid on the top. The victim would be stripped, tied with ropes on all four limbs, and then like some elaborate Marvel movie setup behind the scenes, they get lifted into the air and suspended just over top of the pyramid. Then their bits are adjusted to sit right on top of the pyramid. From here, the captive holder could torment them further, try to get confessions, whatever, before letting loose more and more of the person's own body weight, which would slowly impale them downwards on the pyramid, which in turn would start making room for itself. This punishment method was frequently used in the Inquisition, but I invite you to guess when else. Could it be A, witchcraft, B, witchcraft, or C, witchcraft? If you guessed any of those three, you're right, because pretty much every medieval punishment for a woman was because she talked too much or made a soup that tasted too good, so the devil must have done it. Alright, last in our little ripping montage, number 1 is the rail rip, aka a wooden horse, also known as riding the rail. It's an effed device of which there are 2 variations. The first is like a balance beam from gymnastics but triangular, mounted on a sawhorse-like support. The victim is made to straddle the triangular horse and place their full body weight down on the hoo-ha area, which rested on the blunt point of the angle. Weights and additional restraints were added to keep the victim from falling off, but also to drag them down. Left for days, it can begin destroying your pelvis as well as dislocate all of the joints in your legs. A less immediately painful variation is a single plank of wood supported, again with the wooden legs or sometimes suspended from the ceiling, horizontal from the floor on its side with a thin edge and sharpened extremely. The victim is made to straddle the plank, which is adjusted to their height so that they have to stand on their tiptoes or let their hoo-ha, meet a very serrated fate. This wasn't a witchcraft one ironically, but rather for adulterers, working girls, or women who breathed a little too hard and their husbands wanted them gone.
Number 10. The pillory. Known sometimes as the thew, this was a form of stocks that was used for women. Men weren't the only ones who were condemned to the stocks back in the day. While on paper, standing around in the stocks for a few hours doesn't actually sound that bad, like a bit humiliating and a bit exhausting because you gotta keep your arms up here, but you know, that's about it. In reality, it could actually be very dangerous depending on the crowd's temperaments and the accused's reputation amongst the common folk that had gathered. In some cases, people were badly injured, maimed, blinded, and some actually died as a result of being tormented by those who gathered while they were in the stocks, after suffering great injuries. The unfortunate thing was that you often wouldn't be able to defend yourself because your hands are like restrained. You couldn't move your head, and often your hands are just completely restricted depending on the type of stocks that you're being held in. At least with the thew version, your hands were not restricted because you were like kind of in a collar on a chain, but women also were put in the pillory too, where your hands are restricted, preventing you from defending yourself at all from assailants unless you were being defended by, like, I don't know, guards perhaps. Even then, you're probably still gonna be brutalized in some way. Guards aren't there to, like, you know, make sure that you don't get to feel the punishment. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee and you love when we tell you about some honestly very shocking things that happen in history, be sure to click that subscribe button for even more historical and horrific content. Number 9. Drunkard's cloak. While more popular in the 17th and 18th century, there is still documentation of the drunkard's cloak being used into the mid-19th century. It was a punishment given to both men and women, usually those who had a bit too much to drink. However, the punishment was also administered to women who were considered to be promiscuous, like so many of the things that are on this list. If you were sentenced to the drunkard's cloak, you'd basically be made to walk around town in like an upside down, heavy and cumbersome barrel with holes cut out for your head and your hands. Honestly, this is one of the least awful ones on the list. At least you're just in a barrel. It doesn't sound like it would be fun, but it doesn't sound like it would be like the worst. I feel like I could walk around for a few hours with a barrel on and I'd be alright. Number 8. Shrew's fiddle. I have a question. Why are there so many devices that were created in the Middle Ages hundreds of years ago that were still used up until the early 1800s and beyond? That seems insane to me. The Shrew's fiddle is one of those instruments, but despite being named after a musical instrument, it is instead an instrument of torment. It was used to punish women who were deemed too shrewish, and in some places in the world, it wasn't just used on women. The woman in question would be forced to put her neck through a large hole, with her wrists being held in the smaller holes, so her hands were basically up in front of her but were immobilized. Number 7. Scold's bridle. Despite the fact that this device can be traced back to the 1500s, there are also records of it being used as late as the early 1800s into the 19th century, which is honestly crazy to me. Like, I can't even imagine someone trying to silence me with this device today. Goodness, horrific and humiliating. The scold's bridle was used to silence women who were being too loud, either speaking their mind too much, being caught gossiping, or just literally, being too loud. Pretty wild when you think the same society that decided this was a good punishment is also kind of the same society that encouraged women to gossip by pitting them against one another and also, silencing them. So that probably many women felt the only way they might be able to safely speak their minds about something was, like whisper behind someone's back for fear of them hearing and what would happen then. But then of course, if you do get heard, this is what you get, because people are like, we don't want you to whisper, we just want you to shut up. Seems like a weird cycle though to me. It's like we created the problem and then we just basically punished people for the problem we created. This scold's bridle was a mask that women were forced to wear. Oftentimes it was made to look demonic or ugly in terms of the features on the mask, and it had a painful restricting metal gag inside that would literally hold down the wearer's tongue so they couldn't physically speak. Which sounds terrible. Also then if you try to speak, it could hurt your tongue. Not good. Number 6. Left to cook. Well, sitting by the fireplace is usually seen as being a pleasant way to pass the time, relaxing and soothing. In fact, I was just listening to some fireplace sounds while I was writing today. It becomes a lot less nice and tranquil if you are literally chained to the spot. While the scold's bridle is admittedly awful, it could actually get worse for women confined by the mask. In addition to that punishment, sometimes they would also be chained to the fireplace. Probably by their parents or guardian or their husband, whoever basically would have owned them at that time, until such a time as it was deemed they had learned their lesson. I like to sit by the fireplace, but I like to do it by choice.
Number 5. Status degradation. Status degradation still persists today, and it's been used as a formal punishment throughout history. Under the Roman Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noble women in the Kingdom of Korea during the Chosun dynasty faced a similar degradation of their social status if they were found guilty of adultery or if they just remarried. Adulteresses were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born statuses, and the descendants of widows who remarried were barred from holding office. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Chosun dynasty faced even graver punishment, which is death. Number 4. Pricking and scratching. Another form of torment women had to endure as a type of punishment relates back towards one of the biggest torments women had to face during the witch trials. Witch hunting books and instruction pamphlets, yes, they had an IKEA manual on how to prick a witch. It noted that marks were insensitive to pain and they couldn't bleed. So they would make these specifically designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced their desired results. So basically they would just keep poking you with needles until there was an area on you that just didn't bleed. They even had a job position for this called professional prickers, which many of them would be con men using dulled needles points to identify fake witch marks. Alongside the pricking was the scratching, where they would scratch the supposed victim. So if a victim scratches the accused witch with their fingernails and drew blood and their symptoms of being possessed stopped, then somehow that person that they scratched was a witch. Number 3. Tar and feathering. When I first heard about tar and feathering, it was in a cartoon where the characters would use tar and then feather the characters they wanted to make a fool out of. Tar and feathering originated as a punishment that dates back to Richard I of England. The practice of tarring and feathering was exported to the Americas, gaining popularity in the mid-18th century. Throughout the 1760s, it saw increased usages as a means of protesting the Townshend Revenue Act and those who sought to enforce it. For women, they'd also tar and feather as a form of embarrassment. In a news article in 1906, consisting of 4 young married women from the East Sandy, Pennsylvania, corrected the alleged evil conduct of their neighbor, Mrs. Hattie Lowry. 2 women held Mrs. Lowry to the floor while the others 2 smeared her face with stove polish until it was completely covered, and then poured thick molasses on her head and emptied the contents of a feather pillow over molasses. The women then marched the victim to a railroad camp tied by the wrist, where 200 workmen stopped to watch the spectacle. After parading Mrs. Lowry through the camp, the women tied her to a large box where she remained until a man released her. They did this because they wanted to be part of a vigilant committee which exercises the right to take up the law in their own hands. Reason why they did that to her though is still unknown. Justice for Mrs. Lowry. Number 2. Amputation. Although it may not seem to be as creative as the other instruments of torture on this list, amputation packed a painful and permanent punch. The body of an ancient Chinese woman from about 3,000 years ago have been found with an amputated feet but in otherwise good health, and all signs point to an ancient Chinese punishment called yue, which was used for over 500 different offenses, including cheating and stealing. In ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire, a different type of amputation was common, nose amputation, called rhinotomy, which was a punishment for adulterous women, though it was also used as a punishment for various crimes in medieval and ancient times elsewhere. However, However, the adulterous man might escape with a less severe punishment like a fine or a beating. Number 1. Burnt to death. Although it is noted that the most famous form of torment and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or burn them by the stake, but this was more common in Europe during the very early 1300s to the end of the 17th century. In England and most of their colonies, the witch trials would go on like every other crime, and when someone was convicted of witchcraft, typically they would be hanged. But with the burning alive, that was more specifically used in Europe, especially in Scotland. Women accused of witchcraft and communing with the devil would be burnt, but it was also a common punishment for treason or heresy. A woman might have her limbs covered in tar, as well as being made to wear a tar-soaked dress and bonnet, and she would then be tied up by the neck on a barrel and the fire would be lit. She would be simultaneously burnt and hung in a blazing inferno, or they wouldn't bother to hang her, instead placing a bundle of twigs around her feet so she would be consumed in a sheet of fire and burnt alive. Notably, another famous person who was also in this unfortunate spectacle was Joan of Arc.